And welcome back. So now we're going to do one from a top-down view, but also we're going to do it with a more extreme version of it. So this is probably a little more typical of most shots, you know, that top-down kind of perspective of it. But then as soon as you take the shadow and you go like really heavy downward, it sort of brings it more to the front and again, more dramatic. So another thing to think about when you're shadowing is, and I think I've already mentioned this, I've probably mentioned everything twice at this point, but another thing to think about is what percentage of the character is in light versus dark, and really playing around with that slider, that variable, because you can really intensify things based upon that. And you'll probably find your style for, again, what's typical, what you generally default to. But what's nice about this exercise is it gets you to break out of that comfort zone a little bit and play around with some new concepts. That's really the beauty of zeroing in on any one aspect of your illustrations, because if not, we tend to think about everything at once and default into our comfort zone because we're trying to just get an entire piece out. But if you look at each individual element, then you can really, again, play with, I tend to think of them like sliders, almost like when you're designing a character in a game, you get those cool sliders that, you can tug back and forth. Try to think of that with your own artwork. And all those different variables you can orchestrate to make some cool style choices and designs. So again, really trying to push some of the same shadows, but obviously the shadows are on the bottom of each of these little areas. And so like, even though it might look like right here I'm putting that one above the cheek like we did from the uplight, this is actually the bottom of the eyelid. So some of them are just going to be really close to the other ones, but just on an opposite end. Here we could probably block in the whole eye cavity, really, except for that bottom eyelid. I really like that shadow that shows the the thickness of that bottom eyelid. And that's really the thing you have to think about with a lot of this stuff, like what kind of thickness would I see to each one of these areas of the skin, folds of the the cheek, the eyes. How thick are they? How wide are they? How thick is this ear? If it's a cartoony ear, we'd probably see a pretty big shadow on the bottom. If it wasn't, maybe, and if you didn't want it to feel as thick, you just shorten that shadow and it's going to feel like a thinner volume. So the thickness of the shadow is very descriptive of these areas. And some shadow under the collar. Same thing with the hair. We'll start heavier down here and then just break it up as it comes to the top. Shadow from the glasses. You could even do a shadow from the lens. Now you might render that a little bit lighter, and sometimes it'll become distracting too with neighboring shadows. So you see the bottom eyelid and the shadow from the glasses almost look a bit like two wrinkles under the eye. So we'd have to be a little strategic probably with the rendering there, but I still like it. I'm still going to leave it. Really, this ear would probably be blocked in. Now we could probably bring the shadow from the mustache up a bit higher. Again, we're trying to go for a little bit more drama. Now, the other thing too is we could really push the shadow pretty heavy down here if we wanted. So again, something else we have to do is we have to think about the individual volumes, but then we also have to think about the character entirely in this element of light and shadow, right? So brighter up here, and then as we work down into here, we could really play around with these shadows and pull them up pretty heavily just to see, see if it works. And what it does is, by comparison, it intensifies the light source up here, right? That spherical nature of the top of the head, all that gets more intensified. So we probably don't want to take it too far. It might be a bit much, but because now what it sort of does is it sort of makes the jaw look like it's very thick. And I would say on a character like this, he doesn't have a very thick jaw. He's more of a, you know, a skinnier guy. So I'm going to go back on that part. I think that's a bit too much. But still something to think about. We could still introduce that with the rendering. So let me just go back to here. Pull this back a bit. Because again, it just makes it feel like he's got this really thick jaw, which I don't like that on this type of character. He's more of a scientist, not a football player. Okay, so what else? Probably a little bit more shadow on the iris, even though that's, you know, actually that's probably about right. We could probably even bring the shadow on the bottom of the iris like this. And so what that does, that helps push away that next neighboring edge of the top of the bottom eyelid. Top edge of the bottom eyelid, that's kind of hard to explain right there, but that's what I mean. And so there we go. So that gives us enough to work with. And obviously we could keep pushing that. We could say, well, what if the cheekbone was a little more defined from an angle like this? You know, because it does stand to reason that the shadows would maybe start to curve around the bottom of the cheekbone. So we could play around with that. I mean, there's all sorts of distinctions you could make here. But again, it's really nice comparatively. So what I'm going to do now is I'll bring them all side by side. I'll go ahead and ink them. I'll time lapse it because it'll probably take me a good 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour. I don't know. It depends on how it goes, I guess. But I will. I'll narrate through the process, get the key points about it. And in fact, here, let me just bring them all together right now for you. Okay, so there you go. So now you can see just the, you know, the little bit of difference there. It's not massive, but it's enough to play around with the concept and see, you know, a bit of variation. And again, that variation is great to explore. It will help you develop your style. But let's stop here, head over to the next lesson and ink these, and let's see what we come up with.